Hey, I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to the Decibel from the Globe and Mail. We're about a week into the Olympics that a lot of people didn't want to see happen. And in many ways, those people are being proven right. Enforcing the super strict rules that are in place to stop the spread of COVID-19 has been a huge challenge. People in Japan are not happy about the games. Tokyo's extreme heat has been brutal for the athletes, and the lack of spectators means there's not much of an atmosphere.
This one is just, it's the no fun Olympics. And it's certainly not down to the Japanese people. It's not their fault. But this is the pandemic and their kind of slipshod response to it.
The Globe's columnist Cathal Kelly is in Tokyo, and he says the games are a dud. But at the same time, there's been no shortage of news coming out of the Olympics. Simone Biles has pulled out of the gymnastics team final and the individual all-around competition, sparking a larger conversation about professional athletes and mental health. Canadian women have been winning a lot of medals. On Wednesday, swimmer Oleksiak won her 6th medal, making her the most decorated Canadian athlete to compete in the Summer Olympics. So on this episode, we're going to do a check-in. Today on the show, the Olympics from on the ground in Tokyo. Let's get into it. Hey, Cathal, good morning. Thank you so much for coming on at 6 a.m. from Tokyo.
Well, thanks so much for coming on at the end of your workday.
So I'm talking to you on Tuesday, and I want to start with the big news from today, and that is Simone Biles pulling out of the gymnastics finals. And I know you were really excited to watch her compete. We talked about her last time, and many people consider her to be the greatest athlete of all time. So what happened, and how big of a deal is this?
I mean, the hits keep coming for this Olympics. That's a huge deal. Of course, it's not yet determined fully if she will or won't compete in her individual events. She pulled out of the team event. She talked about her mental health. She said she was experiencing demons and doubt as she took a vault, which turned into one of the worst of her career, and pulled herself out of it in order to salvage the team, which did happen. That highly vaunted American team was already in trouble against Russia, but managed to pull out a silver, which under the circumstances seems like a pretty impressive accomplishment. I mean, if she doesn't compete in the individuals, I've seen some of the promos from NBC. They basically wrap the entire Olympics around her performance. This is an athlete. It's like having the World Series without Babe Ruth. She was supposed to define this Olympics. And as you say, maybe at the end of this stand up there, along with the likes of Usain Bolt, is the greatest Olympians, the greatest athletes of our times. I'm not sure how this affects her legacy if she doesn't compete. I still think she's right up there. But I mean, it's a huge blow to an Olympics that has suffered several of them.
I mean, this couldn't have been an easy decision for her to make. And people have been making the comparison between her and tennis star Naomi Osaka, who dropped out of the French Open earlier this year, and she cited the need to prioritize her mental health. The other person that comes to mind, just because I've been reading about her so much, is Oleksiak, who took some time off after the last Olympics because she was really feeling a tremendous amount of pressure. And I wonder, is this something that we're seeing more commonly among these top tier athletes, like this prioritizing of mental health and being more vocal about the pressures of the job?
Well, certainly that is brand new. That is brand new. 5 years ago, you did not hear about that. 2 years ago, you did not hear about that. I think it speaks to the enormous pressure some athletes and children are under, which starts when they are, just able to hold a tennis racket and pushed and pushed. I mean, you don't get to this level unless it becomes the entire focus of your life. And I think it's not a coincidence that where you see this happening is in individual sports, like athletes who are really just hanging out there on their own, how you would describe Osaka and Biles and Oleksiak. I mean, it is going to be something we have to grapple with going forward. Simone Biles, I can't even imagine the amount of pressure that she's, unlike any other athlete in the sense that she is so recognized, so pedestalized, and yet only gets a chance to prove she belongs there once every 4 years. She gets a few days every 4 years to prove she belongs there. And if it doesn't work out, then she was a fraud, that was all for naught. So, you can imagine how that would get into anyone's head. I'm not shocked, actually. I'm shocked that she has done previous Olympics and this hasn't happened.
So you've been there now for a few days, and tell me what that's been like. How has it been like to cover these Olympics, and how has it been different this time around because of the pandemic?
Well, no one wants to hear the complaints of journalists, so let me give you a few. This one is just, it's the no fun Olympics, and it's certainly not down to the Japanese people. It's not their fault, but this is the pandemic and their kind of slipshod response to it. So it's a lot of measures that don't seem to make a ton of sense when taken in aggregate. It's a lot of what I like to call theater of safety, where, for instance, no spectators are allowed in the venues for fear of contagion. The athletes have to eat in the village with plexiglass shields protecting them from each other, as we all do. But on the first day of the swimming medals, they allowed several hundred athletes and coaches and officials to go up in the stands. A lot of them take their masks off, scream their heads off while their teammates raced, hug each other. It just, it's the perception that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And on the one hand, I don't blame them. They're trying to control two groups of people, athletes and journalists, who tend to be erratic, sort of me first, solo thinkers, high individualists. So it's kind of difficult to wrangle several thousand of them. I am both slightly annoyed with them, mainly for the bus situation. That's a journalist thing. The buses don't work. The buses do not run tomorrow.
What do you mean?
Like the buses are just, there's not enough buses and they don't take you to the places you need to be.
Oh.
So, what should be a 20-minute journey turns into a 3-hour journey as you try to patchwork together a bunch of buses.
Oh, wow.
But again, we're being paid good money to be at the Olympics. So no complaints, even though that's a complaint. I think that's one of these situations you get the strong feeling a week in that they're just trying to get through it.
I mean, so what is the COVID situation there now? Like, I've heard that there are a pretty significant number of people who've tested positive. So it sounds like they haven't been able to keep COVID out of the games. And that's what you predicted the last time we chatted.
I have to say the numbers now, we are talking dozens rather than hundreds or thousands. We haven't heard about any outbreaks into the wider community. I actually think it's miraculous that they've managed to do this. And that's mostly down, I think, to the rigorous standards for getting into the country, which was, of course, the barrier, the only real barrier you could set up that made any sense. It's not a story that I am aware of. The people at Tokyo may be feeling quite differently about it, but their numbers are now reaching historic highs that have nothing to do with the Olympics. That's about exponential spread in their own community.
Right.
You walk around Tokyo, the largest city in the world. I'm looking out the window now. We're right downtown being, basically the size of southwestern Ontario. There's nobody out at 6 a.m. These people are taking their stay-at-home order, for the most part, very seriously.
Right. So the last time we talked, Japanese people were protesting the games, and public polls showed that most people wanted to see them canceled or postponed. And so are people still protesting the games now, or staying at home?
No.
Okay.
No, there were protests at the opening ceremonies, and that could be audibly heard in the arena during breaks in the ceremony itself, during silent periods. But beyond that, no. Mainly because I think in order to do so, you would have to go down to the barren portlands where the Olympics are located and stand in the baking sun. I wouldn't protest either.
Yeah. And so speaking of the heat, Tokyo is known for this extreme heat around this time of year, right? And now there's...
Not known to me. This was entirely news to me. As usual, I have packed all wrong.
I feel really bad for you.
No, you shouldn't feel bad. I am just, as you can see, I am a pasty man of Irish extraction. Heat is not my friend. And it is baking. Now, of course, I am scurrying like a bug between air-conditioned bus and air-conditioned building as best I can. The athletes, I can't even imagine. There have been days here where it's just, it feels like you're walking in wet wool, and it's oppressive. It makes me really question, as many have, why they chose to, it's not to chose to hold it in Tokyo, but why they chose to hold it. Well, I know why. They chose to hold it in July. They did it for TV. They did it for the blank spot in the schedule, so they weren't conflicting with the NFL. These really should have been held in spring or fall.
Yeah, and there have been reports of people like collapsing after their competitions, right? So how has this been impacting the athletes, and what are they saying about the weather?
Oh, the athletes, I mean, Novak Djokovic here, who's, pretty close to a cyborg when it comes to playing in all sorts of conditions, called it brutal. At the triathlon, we've seen the gold medal winner get carted away in a wheelchair. And that wasn't a particularly hot day by the standard of the city. I mean, you can see people just like, there's days we've been standing out at the skateboarding venue, which just reflects heat. And it is like you're hiding. You see people on their knees trying to find patches of shade.
Wow.
It is that oppressive. I don't know how they're doing it, but every athlete who's asked about it, of course, says it's terrible and I'm dealing with it, because that's what they have to do.
You wrote about how these games are a dud, and maybe being there with like no fans and all these restrictions is making it a dud for you as a reporter there. But is it also a dud for its main audience, which is people watching on TV?
Yeah, I would argue it is. I don't think you can have an Olympics without an audience and it be a good Olympics. Certainly not a great Olympics. We can see the TV ratings are way down, and people like to. And obviously some of that's North American TV ratings. Time zone issues are a big part of that. But that doesn't really affect NBC, which is constantly tape delaying, has always done that, tape delayed the events and shown them in prime time. I think it's that when it's this dreary, when there's no atmosphere, when all you see is the coaches, a couple of scattered coaches up in the stands, it just doesn't feel like an Olympics. It's the visual cue that the thing you are watching matters. And the Olympics, for the most part, for most of us, you take a few events out of there. Simone Biles in gymnastics, the 100-meter final. You're watching atmosphere. You're watching judo. You're watching canoeing. You have no clue what's happening. And you're there for the atmosphere. And people on TV are excited, so you're excited.
Right. So there is a change happening in broadcasting that I wanted to talk about. And that's the fact that the games are trying to banish overly sexualized images of female athletes. How did this come about, and how are they going to do it in sports like gymnastics and volleyball where women's uniforms are revealing?
Don't leer. The camera can leer. Like, it's pretty obvious what you shouldn't do. It doesn't strike me as extremely difficult. I don't think that also means that you only focus in on, people above the shoulders. I think what you do is you treat them as you would treat male athletes, which is to say, no particular close-ups, no lingering shots on, from the waist down. I don't think, like, the fact that it's kind of a thing strikes me as ridiculous. Like, right. Did this memo not go out 20 years ago? Like,
so why do this now? Why hasn't this happened for so long?
There's a lot of weird things about the way female athletes in particular have to dress. And in certain sports, they're so fixated on certain modes of dress. Just let people wear what they want to wear. Like, I watch track. Track has morphed from people wearing shorts and T-shirts, essentially, to now they wear what looks to me like a one-piece bathing suit. I can't imagine how that is comfortable to run in, but I assume there's a reason for it. I assume they all do it for a good reason, which has something to do about cutting 1/100th of a second off the time. Just let the athletes pick their own uniforms. And I think that's what's going to come out of Tokyo, is this idea that maybe we shouldn't enforce these rules, which are entirely arbitrary. Just let people pick what they want to wear.
Right. And so this is coming after a number of controversies in a bunch of different places. So gymnasts in Germany decided that they were going to wear unitards that covered their legs, right? And then in Norway earlier this month, women refused to play beach handball in bikini bottoms, and they wore shorts instead, and they were fined for breaking those rules. And there's been a lot of controversy around that.
I have to say, from my own perspective, I don't believe these are controversies. I think these are manufactured controversies. All the talk about the bikini bottoms in handball. When was the last time you talked about handball? Like, I can't even tell you how handball is played. It was brilliant. If that was a PR campaign, whoever thought it up should be given a very large bonus at the Handball Association.
Have you been paying attention to any of the new sports at the Olympics this year?
I mean, I'm not a fan.
Okay.
I gotta say. Not a fan. The Olympics is based on this idea of tradition rolling forward to try and make the Olympics contemporary, which is what this is a transparent effort to do, to try and peel away the X Games crowd and grow your customer base, I think is contrary to all the things that have made this event iconic in the first place. The problem with a lot of the new sports to me, too many are judged. I am, as a general rule, not a fan of judged sports. It's too subjective. It's not an objective competition. So shot put is not judged. Shot put is just pure strength. A great example of a perfect sport in its simplicity. Anybody can do it. Not everybody can skateboard. Not everybody does skateboard. We're winnowing these things down to things nobody does. Like, the beauty of the Olympics in its most pure form is it's running, swimming, jumping, throwing, something everyone has done. But yet they continually pile on new sports in a transparent attempt to make more money.
Interesting hot take. So let's talk about how Canada is doing at these games. We actually had an episode last week about the competitive edge that the Canadian women's swim team is trying to get by using data analytics. And overall, they've done really well so far. And I know these games have been kind of a dud for you, but there's got to be some exciting moments that you can tell me about. Can you tell me about watching swimming and what that's been like?
Oh, let me draw a strong line between what I think is a dud Olympics and what I think is a dud Olympics for Canada. I mean, Japan is throwing a dud event and having an incredible Olympics. Last I looked, they led the Olympics in medals, in golds, which is how the IOC measures it. Canada's having a great Olympics so far. I mean, the best thing I've been to so far was Maggie Mac Neil's gold medal in butterfly. What a sport, what a competitor. That was something also done under enormous pressure. She was the defending world champion, but most people thought she wasn't the favorite. And yet she comes out and wins that gold. I mean, that's what this is about. You can think of an Olympics as a whole, as the event in its entirety, which is the way I'm talking about it, from a purely rah-rah Canada patriotic perspective. Canada's doing great. It's time to start talking about Canada as not a powerhouse in the Summer Games, but the old cliche is that Canada is a powerhouse in winter and, just kind of also ran in summer. We show up, we field some athletes, but Canada's now, I think, solidly in the middle of the pack. I think this, based on pace alone and the fact that people who weren't necessarily being touted for medals are winning them, this could be even better.
All right, Cathal, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for today. I'm Tamara Kendacker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Cathal Kelly. To find more from Cathal, you can sign up for the Globe's Tokyo Olympics Update newsletter at tgam.ca/newsletters. You'll get it every day with highlights from Tokyo and a roundup of our coverage so you can stay in the know. Again, that's tgam.ca/newsletters. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.